our own world. This was America, small town America, where things like that just didn't happen.
It was a very strange and seemingly good time in the country. But it wasn't a good time at all, and most of us knew that. But if you think about it, and you think of where we were before Psycho and where we were after Psycho, it's almost like Psycho was the robin that tells you winter is here. And it sure as hell came.
Mother! Oh, God! Mother! Blood! Blood!
Don't change your basic patterns, strange as they may be. The way you are, oh my darling, you never can belong to anybody else but me. I love your streak of cruelty, your psychopathic lies, the homicidal tendencies shining in your eyes.
The discovery of a mutilated woman's body found in the woodshed of an old farmhouse near Plainfield, Wisconsin. Police from throughout the region are investigating at the scene.
Heard the radio that night, a woman up in Plainfield, Wisconsin had been murdered, and I remember trying to think, when we got to this house that we'd heard about in the news flash, would Mrs. Warden still be hanging from the rafters?
The sheriff wanted to see me in Plainfield. So I came in from deer hunting and went to Plainfield and went out to the house with the sheriff. It was dark and we all had flashlights. And the sheriff took the shed. I went into the kitchen and Deputy Fritz went into the living room until the sheriff called that he had found her hanging in the shed.
I came up the drive and went around the back where Mrs. Warden had been found in the shed. And off that shed is the door into the back of the farmhouse. From a reporting standpoint, there was a problem with this story in that the things that were found were so horrible and so grisly that we couldn't write them.
Oh, of course, seeing her there without a head and cut open like you would a deer, it would make anybody kind of sick. But Deputy Fritz did get sick and went outside and sat in his squad where there was heat, and that made him sicker yet. And he didn't come back in the house after that.
Well, what caught my attention right away in this story was the fact that it was the opening of deer season, and here was a innocent woman, the owner of a hardware store, that had been handled and murdered and then dressed out like a deer. I mean, this to me was just revolting. It was a stark, terrible image in my own mind, and I think this, when I first heard it on the radio, I immediately saw this in my own mind. Plainfield was a typical American farm community, a small place where very conservative people, people who were not accustomed to having a horrible crime like this committed in their midst. These were very warm people, friendly people, unsuspecting people.
I watched the late news at 10 o'clock, and the newsman said that there had been a murder in Plainfield, but they didn't say who or what kind or anything. So I ran across just a little driveway and asked Irene if she knew anything about it, and she said yes, that it was Mrs. Worden that was killed, and she said, "You'll never guess who they picked up." And I said, "Well, who was that?" She said, "Eddie Gein." And we couldn't, either one of us, believe that he would hurt anybody, and that was really all she knew. So we discussed it, and we just knew Eddie wouldn't hurt a fly. So I went home and locked my door for the first time in years.
What kind of a man did you know him as?
Well, Menem is a nice man, just like anybody else. The only difference I'd say in the man, he seems to be a little odd.
Odd.
Odd,
you ever
yeah.
suspect anything like this? Or?
No, I'd say he was more or less a pleasant man who would be a nice man to talk to, or somebody who would like to have around. He seems to be a harmless fella, you know.
Boy, I knew him pretty near all my life, probably from the time I was 6 years old. I don't know of anybody else that is real close to Ed like I had been. He was a lonely man. He was quiet, and he was withdrawn. He wasn't very outgoing, and kind of, some people thought he was a hermit, I guess.
Sales receipt for a gallon of antifreeze found at the Worden hardware store points to a suspect who's alleged to have shot Mrs. Worden with a .22 caliber rifle from her store. The suspect has not been named, but it's known that the victim's body was found on the farm of one Edward.
Just a few hours after he had butchered Mrs. Worden, Bob Hill, one of the neighbor boys, came over and asked him for a ride into town, and he obliged. The young man drove him into town.
It was getting late, so my folks said, well, Ed was good enough to take you to town, we'd invite him in for supper. So we were in the house eating supper that night, and brother-in-law came in from deer hunting, and he wanted to know what all the commotion was going on in town. There was a lot of squad cars in town and red lights flashing and that sort of thing. So I asked Ed, I said, well, let's go to town and see what's happening. He said, well, yeah, that'd be fine. We got in the car, and he had the car started up and running, and then another car pulled up out in the road, and it was a county squad car. He came over to the car, and Ed opened his window, and Dan says, are you Ed Gein? And he says, yeah. And he said, well, I'd like to talk to you. And, well, then they took him off to Watoma right then and there, and that was actually the last time that I'd ever seen him.
So many things happened all at once, it seemed like. It was like being hit with a hammer every day. Every day something new came out, something new and horrible.
Amid the filth and squalor of the suspect's house, lawmen have found a grisly collection of preserved body parts and human skulls and skeletons. Crime lab investigators are now trying to determine how long this man may have been killing and how many unsolved murders in the area he may have committed. More news on the House of Horrors.
The experts from the Wisconsin Crime Lab who had come here from Madison had been on any number of homicide investigations in the past, but they had never seen a situation that they came upon as they found in Ed Gein's house. The death mask, the body parts, and the upholstered furniture made from body parts. They just couldn't believe what they were coming across.
This wasn't just a grisly murder. This was an event that, a horrible event that kind that had not, to my knowledge, occurred in a small town before. And the headline on the story was "House of Horrors Stuns the Nation."
It's a nice little town, and everyone is friendly and more than willing to help their neighbors. No one really knew how to cope with it.
Well, I think one of the really significant things about Gein is that, in a sense, he Americanized horror. Before Gein and the films that sprang from the obsession with his case, the monsters that populated horror films were always foreign in some way. They either came from Egypt, the Mummy, Dracula from Transylvania, or from outer space. And with Gein, you really get the beginning of a very, very specifically American kind of horror.
Hi, would you like a room? Our rates are $35 on the weekdays, $37 on the weekends, or $165 a week. If you'd like to see a room, number 4 is open. Help yourself. Thank you.
I think that the timing of Psycho had a great deal to do with its success, because it was kind of like blasting things open. It was saying, yeah, you go in that motel with your kids and your wife, and you think everything's wonderful, and the guy who runs the motel is murdering young women.
Just tell me where Norman Bates came from. Where did you get the idea for Norman from?
At the time I lived in Wisconsin, there was a murder committed by Mr. Ed Gein, generally called Ed Gein. And all that interested me about this gentleman was the fact that he had lived in a town even smaller than the one I was living in, and was able to get away with murder without anybody finding out about it. I said, there's got to be a story here. But I didn't go over to this little town of Plainfield because I couldn't. I didn't even have a car to drive over there. And very little was being said about it because in those days the press was quite prudish about giving details. So I had to more or less invent this character. So I invented Norman Bates. I gave him the traits that he might need, an amnesic fugue that would allow even himself to be ignorant of the crimes he was committing. I invented him as a character, and I built him a motel, and I installed a shower in it for him.
In the story itself, in the film, we saw very, very little violence. It was all psychologically in the head of the leading man. The horror was the horror of the Bates Motel. The horror was the horror of the insane brutality of it all. That original story that it had was too horrible. That you didn't talk about dismembering people and cutting their guts out and doing the things that they do today as a matter of course. You didn't want to hear that. Films were entertainment in those days.
Of course, the victim, or should I say victims, hadn't any conception as to the type of people they would be confronted with in this house, especially the woman. She was the weirdest and the most... Well, let's go into her bedroom. Here's the woman's room, still beautifully preserved. And the imprint of her figure on the bed where she used to lay. I think some of her clothes are still in this wardrobe.
Crime Lab had no further comment. In a bizarre new twist at the death farm, a sealed room has been discovered. It's believed to have been preserved untouched since the death of the suspect's mother 12 years ago.
Then there was a room that they had opened up that had been closed off. That was his mother's room. And it was the only neat preserved room in the house. There was the bed there, a stand with a Bible, and it was dusty. It had an old rose hue color to it, and it just pale and sort of washed out. But that was the only neat place in the house.
Gein was pathologically attached to his mother. He had a very extreme form of a love-hate relationship with her. She seemed to treat him in a way that is often characteristic of mothers who produce schizophrenic children, which is a constant alternation between extreme forms of criticism and then smothering him, really, with this maternal love and devotion.
It was by psychiatrists that said that he was so in love with his mother, that's why he had to rob these graves and bring parts of women back to remind him of his mother. But that's psychiatrists.
Shrinker man, put me straight if you can. Free me of my tics and twitches, disconnect my latent switches, shrinker man. Shrinker man, wise me up if you can. Air my problems and excuse me, sympathize and unconfuse me, shrinker man.
Well, Mr. Gein's mother was a very domineering woman, and he listened to her because mother was a dominant theme in his life. And then when mother died and he could not raise her from the dead as he'd hoped he could, he then wanted to find replacements. As if looking for a replacement for his mother, he brought one home and hung it up in his summer kitchen on that. All of these elements could come into it. If he couldn't have his mother when she was deceased, then he'd have to have a mother substitute.
This young man, you had to feel sorry for him. After all, being dominated by an almost maniacal woman was enough to drive anyone to the extreme of, well, let's go in.
I think that it was a bigger movie than anybody thought it was going to be, including me. It took on size. It became important, and I think a lot of the talk about how terrible and shocking it was because we didn't want to necessarily talk about how important all this was. A boy attracted to his mother, a boy who won't bury his mother. I mean, it's terrible, terrible ideas are in that movie, and they had to be made palatable.
Do you go out with friends?
Well, a boy's best friend is his mother.
The groundbreaking episode would be, I suppose, number one, the incestuous element, which I don't remember, apart from Cecil B. DeMille, anything incestuous in any popular movie.
But all of these things contributed, I think, to formation of the character, who in my book is about 10 years older than he was portrayed on the screen. Whereas in the book I can get away with having a middle-aged man as my murderer without necessarily implicating him. But in those days the conventions of films were such that anybody over the age of, say, 30 was either funny or wicked.
In order to unnerve the audience, it was necessary to make fun of some things, to talk about some things that I wasn't supposed to talk about. In a way, I was being a bad boy. I was talking about pornography, which implies masturbation. I was talking about sex in the afternoon, which was not popular in 1959. Shacking up on your lunch hour, all these things that kind of made you want to giggle. What I wanted to do was to set the audience up for the murder by having them already unconsciously disturbed. I remember telling Hitchcock that I would like to see the toilet in the movie, that we had never seen a toilet on the screen before, and that I would like to even hear it flush. And he was kind of bemused by this and not quite certain what I was getting at. And I said, well, you know, there's the toilet training problem. And it was a big Freudian thing at the time. So he was quite taken with the notion that everybody would be moved more deeply by the fact that they'd had poor potty training.
Well, it's too horrible to describe. Dreadful. And I'll tell you, there's a very important clue was found here. Down there.
I just kind of wanted to unglue the audience a little bit, so that when that came, it would almost be as if they were being attacked. And to be naked and wet, it puts us in a very vulnerable position. There are very few things in life that we want to have happen to us while we're naked and wet.
I have not been able to take a shower since seeing it, seeing that sequence in the movie. There have been times when I have been in some locale that only had a shower or something. In that case, I have the shower curtain or door open. The bathroom door has to be open, and I will face that door. Even if the water's coming from the back, you know, in other words, I'm not going to be caught unawares, is my fear.
In films at that time, there could be a lot of violence so long as I was just hitting somebody, or just killing somebody, shooting somebody, or stabbing somebody. But if I wanted to then take the skin off the victim, the production code would have said, no, 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 you can't do that. The world, I think, is a killing place. We like to kill things. We hunt for food that we don't need. We say it's for food, but it's not. It's to kill. Ed Gein killed one of his victims in exactly the same way that people kill deer. And in a way, I guess he was saying, what the hell's the difference? Whether it's a deer or a human being. If we're going to kill, let's kill.
You cannot cover a person like Ed Gein without trying to figure out what hell ever motivated him to commit these terrible crimes.
Mr. Gein, in his younger years, had been exposed to animals being slaughtered. His parents ran a grocery store and a meat market, and he was told never to go back in that one area there. One time he did see Mother with a bloody apron on, and that made a lasting impression on him.
Seeing his mother standing there, cutting it open, and she turned slowly around and looked at him, and that memory, that image, remained powerfully alive in his imagination throughout his life. You know, his gigantic mother standing there, brandishing this razor-sharp butcher knife with the entire front of her body just dripping with the blood and guts of this butchered animal.
if you've ever heard an adult tell you about when they tortured a bird and killed it, you are understanding why Norman Bates is so wonderful to us. He's the kid who's doing it and getting away with it.
Even after Marion is killed, you understand this weak person who is trying to cover up for his mother, and you empathize with this man. You truly do.
Here's a man who was least likely to seemingly be the individual who was not aggressive, is quite passive, somewhat effeminate, that it would be a situation where, hey, if this guy can do it, others can do it too.
You know, Jerry?
It was frightening because they thought they knew each other, they thought they knew all the people in the community, yet here was a man who would babysit, take care of them, be friendly, help them out, and they did not know what was going on beyond the door of his house until it was all discovered.
I tried to make, and Hitchcock certainly filmed it, to make everything terribly ordinary. And even once you got inside Norman Bates's house, it wasn't a dark back alley. It wasn't all you had seen before. It was kind of bringing murder home.
But to me, the most telling picture in our whole story is this wonderful portrait that Francis Miller took of Ed Gein, and there you can see the killer in this man's face, the whites of his eyes underneath the pupils, this kind of hollow-cheeked look. I mean, the neighbors all claimed that Ed Gein was a benign man, but here there's something to me that's very striking about this picture that tells you that this man could be a monster.
I think the Cold War, as we call it, had unearthed some terrible feelings in people. Everybody seemed to be pretending to be something that they weren't. Now, of course, we take it for granted that if there's a lovely family living down the street, probably one of the children is being molested. But in those days, we didn't. Nobody ever thought about it. So I think that there was a kind of terror growing. We were moving into a very different culture than we had been used to.
This set off horror and feelings in many in the nearby communities, and the medical clinics had reported a number of gastrointestinal reactions with ulcers, nausea, vomiting, upset stomachs, and they had to be pacified and treated by their family doctors because they were very frightened that they may have accidentally been involved with cannibalism.
My relatives that lived in a town close to Ed Gein told me these terrible stories, these tales of human skin, lampshades, and furniture, and such as that. A little bit of grave robbing, I think. But I grew up with that like a kind of like a campfire tale, you know, a horror tale you tell in a story and tell in the woods. And I didn't really know the man's name. I didn't even know about Ed Gein. I just knew about something that happened that was horrendous. But that image really stuck, and I grew up with that kind of burning in my mind.
the poster said, "What happened is real. You know, now the movie that's just as true," or something to that effect. What you see in that film is really a version of a very old and widely distributed kind of folk story about taboo rooms or houses that you are forbidden from entering, which is known as the bloody or forbidden chamber. But of course, people do enter it, and what they discover there is a room full of dismembered corpses, and they themselves then are killed and dismembered and so on. So the facts of the Gein case become assimilated to this kind of story. It's as though there is some archaic level of our mind which makes sense or comprehends these horrors in terms of these stories.
I was thinking to create a house of kind of ultimate horror, a house that said and smelled and tasted death. And there again, bringing the image up of death, the reminder of the grand monster. I had to dress and redress that house many times to get the look I wanted. To get like a totem of bones and artwork, you know. I mean, someone that had been tinkering with, I mean, right down to the bone and to the marrow. Someone that could, in fact, just roll their sleeves up and dip their hands into death itself. I had a realization that the monster was the monster in us all, and was death, and was madness, and so I approached it as a kind of documentary.
Grave robbing in Texas is this hour's top news story. An informant led officers of the Muerto County Sheriff's Department to a cemetery just outside the small rural Texas community of Newt early this morning. Officers there discovered what appeared to be a grisly work of art. The remains of a badly decomposed body wired
I don't remember a whole lot about the grave robbing part of it, but I know that was another pretty morbid bit of it, and people were really shocked that, you know, they're departed people and then have to be disturbed.
Oh, they did feel it was worse robbing the graves than the murder was itself, because it involved more people, actually.
When I discovered Ed Gein really did some of the things that I think I don't know, I pulled out of collective consciousness or something, and he actually used meat hooks and cured parts and was accountable. It truly surprised me.
The former sheriff from Washoe County by the name of Specs Murney asked the present sheriff to fry up a steak for Mr. Gein. And he took that in there and watched him while he was eating that steak, and then asked him a question that, is that better eating than the human body eating? And all Ed Gein did is looked up and smiled a little bit and kept on eating.
There's a quality of wonder about our relationship to Gein. It's as though one of those figures that haunts the very darkest places of our minds has suddenly appeared in bright daylight, stepped out into the real world, you know, and we're encountering a supernatural monster made flesh. I read Texas Chainsaw Massacre as a fairy tale which has a great deal to do with Vietnam War anxieties among the young. It seems to be a vision of America transformed into this vast killing machine, you know, that is feeding off its own young.
The death machine was a part of the Vietnam War. Life is cheap. It was a part of the statement. Life can be bought and sold. You can eat life. We live on life. That had to do with the cannibalistic aspects of the film. Things are scary. The news is scary. The times are scary. We were young and naive back then, and we didn't know where all of this was heading. But now horror is taking a different shape.
I think that the degree of detail that we were trying to achieve in our film was to take the story and to understand it from a psychological point of view, to try and get at the foundation, the fundamental reasons for why he did what he did. And indeed, in order to do that, you had to kind of get into the mindset of a person such as Gein.
In the case of Silence of the Lambs, you really have a film, I think, which has a great deal to do with the preoccupation with aging and death and the obsessive, narcissistic, pathological efforts to create the perfect body at all costs. I'd fuck myself.
No!
This character, Gum, kills women and then skins them to try and put the skin on himself. You know, he wanted to spend a certain amount of time in his basement, and then he was going to come out a beautiful butterfly and feel better about himself, ultimately, was the Gum version. I think in Gein's case, it was a little bit more complex.
From his own confessions, we know that he used to parade around, often outside on moonlit nights, and apparently pretend he was his mother.
With Mrs. Warden, I think it was a situation of infatuation, of a matter that he had some interest in her. She resembled his mother. His mother was gone. He needed a substitute. Here was a situation where he could not accept a woman in life. It had to be a woman in death, as had been his theme. And here was a situation that he obtained a fresh woman, one that he had murdered, one that he eviscerated, and it was not somebody that he was extracting from their tomb. This is a man who was becoming more and more sick.
The point when we realized we were going to have to dress out Gum's basement and also develop a look for the house in which Gum lived in, we definitely drew upon the photographs of the Gein house. We wanted the reality to be as close to what we knew to exist, at least in the case of Ed Gein, because we felt that this character was very, very close to Ed Gein in mentality. The details that sort of made our job both horrible and funny at the same time had to do with getting into the nature of what the skin suit was going to be. I can remember showing it to Jonathan and putting it on a mannequin down in the basement. And being sort of, and then the rest of the crew was standing around, and we unveiled this thing. And then I felt very awkward about it and kind of embarrassed, and because here was this woman's body and many patches and forms, and kind of, well, it was ugly. It had to be ugly. And actually, Jonathan was concerned because he thought it was still too beautiful, and we needed to do more to it that would make it look more hideous. I think it's all about people's version of beauty and what they think that is beautiful for them. And it does become what you see on the surface. And I think that Gein and Gum both suffered from terrible, terrible feelings of ugliness, inadequacy, self-consciousness about who they were as children. They were both unhappy, unnourished boys who felt that they did not have any kind of beauty about them whatsoever. Within all of us is probably some grain, some perverse grain of the kind of existence that a Gein or a Gum lives. And it's only because of our own social upbringing that we squash it. And I think that once we understand that about people, that's what makes this all so fascinating to us, and why we are so fascinated by such characters.
With the fan club, we started just with the shirt. It became a very big seller. We have a lot of people writing in as far as any kind of additional merchandise. Well, we saw there was such a mass appeal for Ed Gein that we formed the official International Ed Gein Fan Club, which was, I admit, it sounds really funny, the Ed Gein Fan Club. But it's more of an appreciation society for the man who influenced numerous horror movies, classic horror movies, and some that are considered among the best today.
I mean, the people who respond most powerfully to Gein, the people who have little scale models of Ed Gein decorating their houses and wear Ed Gein t-shirts and subscribe to Ed Gein journals. I mean, obviously, you're not talking about the populace at large. You're talking about a very particular kind of audience. They're somewhat misfits to some extent. And I think that, on some level, Gein is their patron saint. I don't, perhaps that's not the right word, but I think that Gein was the kind of archetype in that sense of the horror-obsessed, gore nerd person, who collects all this horror stuff.
We get letters written in broken English. I be a big fan of Ed Gein for many years. Please send me, information. How to may I join? The interesting thing is this, the controversy that it has caused. We have so many newspapers and things that have been wanting to do articles on the fan club that we've been doing because it's so sick. But it's so much fun, and you've got to take this with a grain of salt.
I think the feeling of empathy for killers has escalated since the making of Psycho and the unfortunate Ed Gein case.
Today it seems there's a glorification of killers, of serial killers. I think filmmakers, my advice to filmmakers is to be very cautious, because when Chainsaw 1 was made, it wasn't yet realized the power of film and the cause and effect of values.
That's the problem with a case of this sort. You always remember the person that did the deed rather than the ones that have suffered in the hands of the one that did it, if they murdered them or tortured them or whatever they had done.
And here, of course, we have the picture of Mrs. Warden, an open casket funeral where they kind of reassemble her for the funeral. I don't know how they did that. I mean, after all, her head had been severed. She'd been eviscerated, but they got her back together enough for the public to view this open casket. That's amazing, I think.
She was dressed in I think it was a purple or lavender dress. You could see that she was made up, her hair, her glasses, and it would be hard to conceive that would, you know, this woman had done to her what Ed Gein did. The minister gave a homily of sort of like reconciliation for the community, and then they all, you know, marched off to bury Mrs. Warden in the graveyard the same graveyard where Ed Gein had robbed graves.
I feel so terribly bad about it because of the horrible way she died, and such a circus was made of the whole thing, and I feel very badly for the Worden family. I just wish there was something someone could have done.
You go to a car accident, there's always people there who want to get close, see if they can see blood. I don't know what the reason is.
The bad do what the good only dream. I think that sums up the fascination, not only with Gein, but with horror in general.
The house burned down. It was under, in my opinion, mysterious circumstances. I think there might have been more evidence in there.
The fire department, I think it was the slowest they ever went to a fire, because everybody in Plainfield wanted that house burnt down, because there was a man that wanted to buy the farm and turn it into a museum-like or sightseeing for people and charge to get in the house. So we were all happy that it was burned down, and no big investigation was made of it, because we wanted the house going.
Why did they keep the heat on in Eddie Gein's house?
Why?
So his furniture wouldn't get goosebumps.
What was Ed Gein's numbers when he went to prison?
What?
I-812.
Next on BBC2, Hitchcock's classic horror, Psycho.